If you don't want the truth, don't ask the question. He said he wanted honesty about my body count, so I gave it to him. It's not my fault he couldn't handle it. Everyone keeps acting like I deliberately sabotaged my relationship by revealing information that was designed to hurt or shock my boyfriend. But they have no idea what actually led to that moment or why my answer felt so natural and appropriate, given the conversation we were having about honesty and openness in relationships. We were in the middle of packing for our long-awaited beach vacation to Costa Rica, a trip we'd been planning for months as a celebration of our 6-month anniversary and a chance to really connect without the distractions of work and daily responsibilities. The bedroom was covered with clothes, toiletries, and travel accessories as we tried to figure out what to bring for a week of relaxation and romance in paradise. The packing process had been fun and intimate, with lots of playful discussions about which outfits would look best in photos, whether to bring fancy clothes for nice dinners, and how much sunscreen would be necessary for someone with my pale complexion. We'd been laughing and flirting while making decisions together, and the whole experience felt like a preview of the romantic getaway we were both so excited about. That's when Ryan decided to ask the question that would ultimately destroy our relationship and cancel the vacation we'd both been looking forward to for so long. He was folding shirts into his suitcase when he looked up at me with this casual but curious expression and asked how many guys I'd been with before him. He framed it as wanting complete honesty between us, saying he appreciated that I was a non-traditional woman who didn't feel shame about her past experiences. The question felt like a natural extension of conversations we'd been having throughout our relationship about authenticity, openness, and the importance of being completely honest with your partner, even when that honesty might be uncomfortable or challenging. From the very beginning of our relationship, Ryan had positioned himself as someone who valued truth over comfort, someone who would rather know difficult realities than live with pleasant illusions. He'd told me repeatedly that he found my confidence and lack of shame about my sexuality refreshing compared to other women he'd dated who seemed embarrassed or secretive about their romantic histories. So when he asked for my honest assessment of my sexual experience, I didn't hesitate to give him the truth as I saw it. I told him the number was 50, and still growing technically, since we were still in the early stages of our relationship, and I wasn't sure whether we were heading towards something exclusive and permanent, or just enjoying a fun connection while it lasted. The comment was meant to be both honest and slightly playful, acknowledging the reality of my experience, while also making it clear that I was still open to whatever our relationship might become, rather than making assumptions about our future. Together, in my mind, the number 50 represented someone who'd had enough experience to know what she wanted and what worked for her in intimate relationships. It suggested confidence, sexual liberation, and the kind of self-awareness that comes from exploring different types of connections without shame or apology. But Ryan's reaction was immediate and devastating. The casual, curious expression on his face disappeared instantly, replaced by something shocked and distant that I'd never seen before. He went completely still, like someone had told him devastating news that he needed time to process and understand. For several long moments, we just stared at each other across the bed covered with vacation clothes, while I tried to figure out why he seemed so surprised by information that shouldn't have been particularly shocking, given everything he'd said about valuing honesty and appreciating non-traditional women. Then, without any explanation or discussion, Ryan put down the passport he'd been holding and told me he thought he'd sit this trip out. Just like that, calm and matter of fact, like he was declining an invitation to dinner rather than canceling a romantic vacation we'd been planning for months. He walked out of the bedroom, and within an hour, I received email confirmations that our flights and hotel reservations had been cancelled. His phone went straight to voicemail, and he didn't respond to any of my texts asking what had happened or why he'd reacted so strongly to information he'd specifically requested. The hours following Ryan's abrupt departure and vacation cancellation were some of the most confusing and frustrating I'd experienced in any relationship. I'd gone from happily packing for a romantic getaway to sitting alone in a bedroom full of unused vacation clothes, trying to process how complete honesty had resulted in complete abandonment. I kept replaying our conversation, trying to identify what exactly I'd said wrong or how I could have presented the same information in a way that wouldn't have caused such a dramatic reaction. Ryan had specifically asked for honesty about my sexual history, had repeatedly told me he valued authenticity over comfort, had positioned himself as someone who could handle truth even when it was challenging. But apparently, there were limits to his appreciation for honesty that he'd never communicated to me directly, and I'd crossed those limits without any warning or opportunity to adjust my approach. I tried calling and texting repeatedly throughout that first evening, leaving messages that ranged from confused to apologetic to increasingly frustrated as it became clear that Ryan was deliberately avoiding all communication with me. Every call went straight to voicemail, every text remained unread, every attempt to reach out was met with complete silence. By the next morning, I was alternating between genuine concern for Ryan's well-being and growing anger at what seemed like an incredibly immature response to information that any adult should be able to process and discuss rationally. We'd been together for 6 months, had been planning this vacation for weeks, had been talking about taking our relationship to the next level of commitment and intimacy. The idea that he would throw all of that away because he didn't like learning about my past experiences felt both shocking and deeply unfair. The silence stretched through the second day and into the third, with no indication that Ryan was planning to communicate with me or explain what had upset him so dramatically. I was left to speculate about his motivations and feelings without any direct input from him about what he was thinking or what he needed from me to move forward. That's when I started getting information through mutual friends who were apparently serving as intermediaries in whatever process Ryan was using to extract himself from our relationship without having to engage with me directly. The first contact came from Sarah, a friend we'd both known since college, who texted me asking if I'd really told Ryan that my number was 50. The way she phrased the question suggested that she'd heard about our conversation through Ryan and was shocked by what he'd reported about my response to his question. When I confirmed that yes, I had given him that number when he'd specifically asked for honesty about my past, Sarah's response was immediate and not particularly supportive. She seemed genuinely surprised that I would share that kind of information, even when directly asked, and suggested that maybe some truths were better left unspoken in romantic relationships. The conversation with Sarah made me realize that Ryan had been discussing our private relationship business with other people, sharing details about our intimate conversation in ways that made me look like the villain in whatever story he was telling, about why he'd cancelled our vacation and disappeared from my life. But it also made me start questioning whether my approach to honesty had been as reasonable and appropriate as I'd initially thought. As the silence from Ryan stretched into its 4th day, I started thinking more deeply about our entire relationship and how we'd ended up in a situation where complete honesty had resulted in complete relationship breakdown. When I'd met Ryan 6 months earlier, I'd been coming out of what I privately called my exploration phase, a period of several years when I'd been deliberately experimenting with different types of relationships, partners, and experiences to figure out what I actually wanted in terms of romance, sexuality, and long-term partnership. This phase had included everything from serious relationships that lasted several months to casual hookups that lasted a single evening, from connections with people who shared my values and lifestyle to experiments with partners who represented completely different approaches to life and love. The number 50 that I'd given Ryan wasn't technically accurate. It was actually a conservative estimate that included only the most significant encounters while leaving out more casual experiences that probably should have been counted if I was being completely precise about my sexual history. But the number also wasn't wildly inaccurate. I'd been sexually active for over a decade, had gone through periods of dating multiple people simultaneously, had experimented with different relationship structures, including some that were explicitly non-monogamous, and had generally approached sexuality with the kind of openness and curiosity that tends to result in extensive experience over time. Throughout this exploration phase, I'd encountered a lot of judgment and shame from both partners and friends who thought I was being too casual about sex, too willing to engage with people I didn't love, too focused on physical pleasure rather than emotional connection. These experiences had made me defensive about my choices and determined to find a partner who wouldn't try to shame me for having lived life on my own terms, rather than conforming to more traditional expectations about female sexuality and relationship behavior. When I'd met Ryan, he'd seemed like exactly the kind of evolved, sex-positive man who could appreciate my experience rather than being threatened by it. He'd talked about valuing authenticity, honesty, and confidence in women. He'd expressed frustration with previous girlfriends who'd been secretive about their pasts or seemed ashamed of their sexual desires and experiences. In our early conversations, he'd specifically mentioned that he found traditional relationship dynamics boring and preferred partners who brought interesting histories and perspectives to their connections. He'd seemed genuinely interested in learning about my past rather than pretending it didn't exist or wishing it had been different. So when he'd asked direct questions about my sexual history, I'd answered honestly, thinking that this transparency was exactly what he'd been asking for throughout our relationship. But apparently, there was a significant difference between theoretical appreciation for non-traditional women and practical comfort with the reality of what non-traditional actually meant in terms of specific numbers and experiences. On the 5th day of Ryan's silence, I finally received the communication I'd been desperately waiting for. Though it wasn't the explanation or reconciliation I'd been hoping for during those endless days of uncertainty and confusion. The text message was longer than anything Ryan had ever sent me, but the content was devastating in ways that made me realize our relationship had been over from the moment I'd answered his question about my sexual history. He wrote that the issue wasn't really about my past or the specific number of partners I'd had before him. According to Ryan, the problem was my attitude about that history and what my response had revealed about my values and approach to intimate relationships. He explained that when he'd asked about my sexual experience, he'd been expecting some acknowledgement that my past included mistakes or experiences I'd learned from, some indication that I viewed my history as a journey toward finding meaningful connection rather than an ongoing celebration of casual encounters. Instead, my response had suggested that I was proud of having had 50 sexual partners and that I saw our relationship as just another entry in what might become an even longer list of experiences. The phrase "and growing technically" had particularly bothered him because it implied that I was still thinking of myself as sexually available rather than committed to building something exclusive with him. From Ryan's perspective, my casual attitude toward my extensive sexual history indicated that I didn't understand the difference between sex and intimacy, that I treated physical connections as entertainment rather than expressions of deeper, emotional bonds. The text went on to explain that he'd realized we had fundamentally different values around sexuality and relationships, and that these differences weren't something that could be resolved through better communication or increased understanding. He wasn't judging me for my choices, he claimed, but he also couldn't pretend to be comfortable with being in a relationship with someone whose approach to sex was so different from his own values and expectations. The message ended with an apology for disappearing without explanation, and a statement that he thought it would be better for both of us if we ended things cleanly, rather than trying to force compatibility that didn't naturally exist between us. Reading that text message was like being punched in the stomach. Not only was Ryan ending our relationship, but he was doing it in a way that made my honesty seem like evidence of character flaws, rather than the authentic communication he'd claimed to value. I immediately tried calling to discuss what he'd written and explain that he'd misunderstood my intentions and attitude, but his phone was still going straight to voicemail. When I tried texting back, my messages showed as undelivered, suggesting that he'd blocked my number entirely. The finality of being blocked hit me harder than the breakup text itself. Ryan wasn't just ending our relationship, he was making it impossible for me to respond to his interpretation of my character or defend myself against accusations that felt unfair and inaccurate. In the weeks that followed Ryan's departure from my life, I was forced to confront some uncomfortable truths about myself and my approach to relationships that his text message had illuminated in ways I'd never been willing to acknowledge before. The truth was that the number 50 hadn't been an exaggeration or a moment of poorly timed honesty. It had been a conservative estimate of my actual sexual experience, and my casual attitude about sharing it had reflected genuine pride in having lived without shame or apology about my desires and choices. Looking back honestly at my exploration phase, I realized that it had lasted much longer and involved much more extensive experimentation than I'd ever admitted to myself or others. What I'd framed as a period of figuring out what I wanted had actually become a lifestyle of prioritizing novelty and excitement over deeper connection and commitment. The apartment felt hollow without Ryan's presence, but it was filled with evidence of patterns I'd been blind to while living them. My phone contained hundreds of contacts from dating apps, social events, and random encounters that I'd collected over years of treating meeting new people like a hobby rather than a search for meaningful connection. My social media accounts told the story of someone who'd been documenting experiences rather than building relationships. Photos with dozens of different men at parties, concerts, trips, and dinners, each representing a brief connection that had been exciting in the moment, but ultimately disposable when something more interesting came along. I started going through old text conversations with previous partners, looking for evidence of the patterns Ryan had identified in my approach to intimacy and commitment. What I found was devastating to acknowledge honestly. In relationship after relationship, I'd maintained the same casual attitude about exclusivity and long-term potential. I'd told multiple people simultaneously that I was interested in seeing where things went, while privately keeping my options open and comparing each person to the others, like I was shopping for the best possible deal. Even in connections that had lasted several months, I'd never fully closed off other possibilities. I'd kept active profiles on dating apps, maintained flirtatious text conversations with other men, made plans that didn't include my current partner because I hadn't wanted to seem too dependent or invested. The men I'd been with had probably all experienced some version of what Ryan had experienced, the growing realization that they were competing with an endless stream of alternatives rather than building something exclusive with someone who'd chosen them over all other possibilities. I'd convinced myself that I was being authentic and liberated by refusing to conform to traditional expectations about female sexuality, but I'd also been avoiding the vulnerability and compromise that meaningful relationships require. Every time someone had tried to deepen our connection or discuss our future together, I'd found reasons to maintain distance or introduce uncertainty that kept them from feeling secure in our partnership. The comment about the number still growing technically hadn't been innocent acknowledgement of our relationship's early stage. It had been an accurate reflection of my mindset about keeping my options open rather than fully committing to building something exclusive with Ryan. Even while we were planning romantic vacations and talking about our future together, part of me had been maintaining the mental and emotional availability that would allow me to move on to new experiences if our connection didn't meet all my needs and expectations. I'd been treating Ryan like he was auditioning for a permanent role in my life, rather than recognizing that I should have been auditioning for a permanent role in his. While he'd been investing time, energy, and genuine affection in building something lasting, I'd been evaluating whether he was interesting enough to warrant exclusive commitment from someone with as many options as I had. Ryan had recognized something about my character and priorities that I'd been hiding from myself, that I was someone who treated relationships as temporary arrangements rather than opportunities for genuine intimacy and partnership. My pride in my sexual history wasn't just about refusing to be shamed for past choices. It was about maintaining an identity as someone who was too independent and self-sufficient to need the kind of exclusive commitment that lasting relationships require. The vacation we'd been planning together had probably felt to Ryan like an investment in someone who was fundamentally unavailable for the kind of partnership he was seeking. My casual revelation about 50 previous partners had confirmed that he was just another experience in a long series of experiences rather than someone I was genuinely choosing over all other possibilities. Looking through our text message history with this new perspective, I could see evidence of how my approach to commitment had been affecting Ryan's confidence in our relationship over time. His messages had gradually become less romantic and more practical. His future planning had become more tentative. His expressions of affection had become more guarded. In the early weeks of our relationship, he'd sent me long, thoughtful messages about how much he enjoyed spending time with me and how excited he was about exploring our connection. But by the time we'd been together for several months, his texts had become more functional and less emotionally vulnerable. I could now see that he'd probably been picking up on my emotional unavailability and adjusting his own investment accordingly. While I'd been congratulating myself on maintaining independence and avoiding codependency, Ryan had been recognizing that I wasn't someone who was fully present and invested in our connection. The gradual shift in his communication style hadn't been about him becoming less interested in me. It had been about him protecting himself from investing too deeply in someone who was treating their relationship like a temporary experiment rather than a genuine opportunity for love and partnership. My honest answer about my sexual history had provided the final confirmation he'd needed to end things before investing more time and emotional energy in someone who wasn't truly available for the kind of exclusive commitment he was seeking. The empty suitcases still sitting in my bedroom weren't just reminders of a cancelled vacation. They were evidence of how my commitment to radical honesty had revealed truths about my character that had made a loving relationship impossible. Ryan had been right to recognize that we had fundamentally different approaches to intimacy and commitment, and he'd been wise to end our relationship before either of us invested more in a connection that was never going to develop into the kind of exclusive partnership he was seeking. The silence in my apartment wasn't just the absence of his voice, it was the sound of consequences for treating relationships as temporary entertainment rather than opportunities for genuine love and commitment. I'd lost someone who'd been ready to plan romantic vacations and build a future with me, and I'd lost him because I'd been too proud of my past to understand what I was sacrificing for the sake of maintaining my identity as someone who couldn't be, tied down or limited by traditional relationship expectations. The most devastating realization was that Ryan hadn't been wrong about my attitude or my priorities. I really had been proud of my extensive sexual experience in ways that made genuine commitment feel like a limitation rather than a choice. I really had been treating our relationship like another entry in my personal catalogue of experiences rather than recognizing it as an opportunity to build something lasting with someone who genuinely valued me. Some truths reveal more than just facts. They reveal fundamental incompatibilities that can't be overcome through better communication or increased understanding. And sometimes, the most honest thing you can do is recognize that you're not ready for the kind of love that someone else is offering, even if that recognition comes too late to save the relationship you've already lost. Lost.